On the cloud. Okay. All right, guys. So I'm excited to talk about motherhood today with a great friend of mine. As you know, motherhood is a web of complex responsibilities that can be sometimes difficult to navigate on our own. And if you add to the mix a 9 to 5 or a business, it gets very intense. Motherhood has taught me personally to appreciate every active parent. And when I say active parent, I talk about every all the dads and the guardians, not just the moms who are doing what needs to be done to fulfill the kids' needs. But for the purpose of this episode, we will focus on the invisible load of motherhood. And to enrich this conversation, I have invited again my dear friend, Chioma Efejedia. Chioma is a registered social worker with over 10 years of experience, but she's right here. So I'm just going to let her introduce herself and then we're going to Kiki. So, welcome on the first episode of Spotlight for 2025.
Thank you for having me here. I really appreciate this. So my name is Chioma Efejedia. I'm the founder of Inner Compass Wellbeing, where we have our own counseling practices and we offer individual counseling to the community. I am definitely a huge advocate of mental health, being a registered social worker, psychotherapist, and really being able to support the needs of our community from a culturally responsive lens. One of the biggest things that I always say is mental health needs to be accessible. So even having these conversations and nuances are super important to our well-being.
Awesome. And I'm super excited to talk to you about this topic that, as I said in my introduction, it's been 4 years for me. So I'm relatively new to this journey of mine being a mother. And there's so many aspects of motherhoods that we often don't talk about in our community, especially around everything that comes with it, like the mental responsibilities, the load, like how to manage the schedules of your kids and then also show up at work and then also show up in your community and etc. and etc. And so I just really wanted to dive into this topic with you and with your expertise and experience, like kind of walk us through this journey, what it is like to have that load and how we can address it. How can we make sure that we thrive in our lives and then kind of just like delegate more if that needs to be done. So I will start by asking you, how would you define the invisible load of motherhood, and what are some common examples of what mothers often experience when it comes to that?
That's a great question. First of all, when it comes to the visible load, it really comes down to emotional capacity or the emotional burden that sometimes comes with parenting, and also the mental load. I like to look at the mental load as having an ongoing to do task list in your head that's just constantly ongoing. And sometimes you don't feel like you're progressing in terms of checking off the box or moving on to the next task. Tasks are just being added on. And then for the emotional capacity, or even the emotional burnout, it's not being able to have the capacity to be there and meet your kids' needs, especially when they're throwing tantrums, or when you come in from work and they're like, "Mom, mom, mom," and you're just like, "Oh my gosh, emotionally, I don't have anything to give you right now." Right. And oftentimes with motherhood, that is the invisible load that we're experiencing. It's the, okay, I need to think about dinner. I need to think about going to this practice. I need to think about your school. I need to think about you getting bathed before getting to bed, and the bedtime story, and like, okay, you need a snack, like let me prep the snack, and then I need to get you ready for the morning, to make sure you're on time for school. And that just ongoing list of never ending tasks, that's
Mm-hmm.
so mundane for mothers.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that will be essentially that difference between emotional labor and then mental labor. Would that be the big difference when it comes to that? It's how to show up for your kids emotionally, or like that capacity versus the mental load where it's like the strategy, like the responsibility, like how to map out the plan to make sure that you achieve everything that you need to do for your kids and everything around it. That will be it.
Absolutely. So again, that mental piece is the cognitive piece. It's the constant
Yeah.
thinking of everything. The emotional piece is being able to have the capacity to hold and regulate their emotions and their feelings and their ups and downs and their loads, and say, okay, do I have
Mhm.
enough to give you right now? Right?
Mm,
In terms of like time, energy, all of those
yeah.
things. That's what that emotional burden or burnout kind of looks like.
And how do you think that it shows up then in like the well-being of a woman? Like in terms of like, okay, that overload, like I'm tired. How do you see it showing up in someone's well-being?
So it shows up in a couple ways. A lot of the women that I speak with in my practice, it comes up in this way of like them saying they're tired, like exhaustedly tired. And they're just like, I'm literally just surviving. I recently started like writing a book of Black women's motherhood stories, and I've been doing a couple of interviews. And one of the things that I've realized is this constant need to, I only have ability just to give the bare minimum, right? And I think that's how that shows up, especially for Black women, for women of color. It's this, I can only give this. I'm going to prioritize what needs to be prioritized, but then we miss a lot of things along the way. And the
Hmm.
overall cycle that I hear is I'm just surviving, right?
Hmm. I can relate to that. I truly believe that there are days where it's really just like one breath at a time. When, especially when you like, I'm not speaking for all women, but there's some women who do have like a professional career, like they have like, a 9 to 5 that is very demanding. And then they also have to take care of the children. And then there's some other moms who are in a different situation where there's not necessarily an active parent in there. So there's different, I want to say different situations. And I can definitely relate to the fact that, as a whole, as just a woman, it's always like a survival mode because of those additional layers of work, of community work, and everything in there. My question then is, why do we not talk more about this? Because I wish those are the conversations that we could have had before entering the journey of motherhood. Not that it would have dissuaded me from being a mom, but I think being more informed about like, okay, these are the other aspects of motherhood. Like you will feel this type of way, and there's a name to it, right? So while, especially in our community, I just feel like sometimes we are just taking on and then taking on, and it's like, okay, it's okay, but we're not necessarily talking about it. Is there a reason as to why we do that?
I think one of the things that I have to say is like the reason is always unique to the individual's experience, right? So I think that's
Mm.
like it's a very broad question for what we
Mm-hmm.
might experience as women. Although I do think there's some commonalities. I think specifically, and I'm going to speak to like the Black woman experience, is there's this need to still work outside the home, right? And that has been
Mm-hmm.
perpetrated from like how long, right? To like still we still need to contribute, we still need to be there, and we need to be all. So like when you think about the superwoman syndrome that a lot of us Black women face, I think those are some of the stereotypes and messages that a lot of us have gotten from a young age. And one of the things that I see as a habit, especially for a lot of women that I work with, is they said, well, I seen my mom do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, like just slowing it down, and as I even start to write my book and I'm starting to do a lot more of these interviews through different ages, is we might have seen our moms doing it, but a lot of them are just surviving, so we normalize that, we normalize
Mm-hmm.
that as a standard. And I also like to think of it too is, when you're in Western world, it's so individualistic that sometimes the priority is only on the nuclear family, and the woman holds that burden, right? Of you got to
Yeah.
keep the household together, you got to make sure the kids are good. So again, a lot of messages from the society as a whole in terms of what that looks like or what a mother should be. If you think
Mm-hmm.
about even in like school systems, or like even my field of study, like when we look at like moms and the roles that they play to child development from like Freudian and all those other therapists. It's such a heavy emphasis on this is what moms need to do, and it has to be self-sacrificing, which I don't necessarily
Yeah.
think is the case.
Yeah. Oh man. And so how do you think that we should, as women then, communicate then this invisible load to our family, our village, our tribe, our partners, who do not necessarily understand the impact that this can have on our well-being, on our mental health.
You know, one of the things that I think before we start even communicating to like our community, our support system, our partners, our family, is we need to be able to
Mm-hmm.
recognize it in ourselves. And there's not a lot of people who, until literally shit hits the fan, they're able
Yeah.
to recognize and say, oh my goodness, like there's something wrong, right? And I think the first step is really being able to empower ourselves to have the language and have these discussions to say, this is what this is showing up, right? Whether that's a friend checking,
Mm-hmm.
say like, hey, you're a little bit off, or I haven't heard from you, or us checking in with ourselves to say something just doesn't feel right now. Like I just feel like I'm on
Mm-hmm.
like a constant go and there's no break, or I completely
Mm-hmm.
feel very irritable, and that's it's not I'm not being supportive for my family as I used to be. So I think before we can even ask for help, we need to be able to identify what is happening for us, right?
Right.
What does this look like? Because in order to pull in our family or pull in those supports, we have to be able to recognize there's something that's not being met here and make a request for that need, right? To say, you know, I have a laundry list of checklists. Um, can you take care of the kids like school? Um, because that's going to be helpful. Can you do the pick up and drop off for any programs that might be in, right? And again, that slowing down piece really helps us to say what are the areas that would actually be helpful for us.
Mm-hmm. I know, I totally get it. And then I know that you answered that question earlier as to like how does it like how do you know? And then it usually starts with like I'm tired. And now when we're listening to you right now, I'm sure that there's some also, and then I think that I am victim of it. Sometimes I think that is just like me being tired because it's too much, but not necessarily putting language to it. Are there other, I want to say, um areas or description of what it will look like other words to put to it, like besides being tired? And then leading to that question is, can this also lead to depression because of like the overwhelming load that comes with it, and then not having to put words to it, and then just keeping on keeping with the load, right? Like, can that lead to other um, elements of mental health, such as depression and or anxiety?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, one of the things that I find with a lot of black women that I work with when they're feeling this emotional burnout, the mental overload of like parenting, of like what we have to carry as mothers, they feel that there's a sense of guilt that comes with it of, oh, I should be, oh, I do need to get out of bed, oh, I need to be able to be helpful, or you know, I need to be able to do all of these things. But who told you that? Like, why do you not have the permission to be tired? Like, can we normalize some of those things? You
Mm-hmm.
know, if your week started off rough, like, is there space for you to say, no, my week started off rough, I need to slow down? And again, because sometimes we get so caught up in the we have to be productive, we have to make sure the home is put together, we have to make sure all of these things are going, we're also putting a lot of pressure on ourselves. And
Yeah.
that pressure can really come, and the way how it shows up in one of color is like irritability. Like depression, you know, sometimes like in Western world, it's like, oh yes, you're sad, you have low mood, but sometimes it comes down to irritability and anger and frustration, and sometimes we don't even know where it's coming from, but it's a buildup of again, having to deal with so much stress and so much load of just running the family, but also having careers outside of that, or you know, speaking even to the single parents who are navigating what this looks like by themselves, right? uh,
Mm-hmm.
it comes with a lot. So I think those are some of the things that we have to recognize and say, okay, the emotions that we might be feeling might be also linked to depression. One of the things that I
Yeah.
see often for the anxiety piece is that overthinking, that constant overthinking. And when things don't get done, it's almost a sense of guilt, right? Or shame, or I'm failing as a mom, right? And those weigh heavy on us and impact our mental health. It impacts the mental load that we're already carrying, right?
Mm-hmm. And I totally can relate to that, whether it's the guilt, whether it's being irritable. I found myself in situations where, like, when I get super irritated, it's because I just really need to disconnect and rest. And I think that's the work that I've done over like the last couple of months. It's like to just like kind of dissociate myself from that sense of guilt that I am not a superwoman and I cannot accomplish everything at the same time. But I definitely, there has been instances where like that guilt took over. Like I should have been able to do this more for my kids. I should have been able to do more like this at work. And then it's that sense of always trying to be, I don't want to say perfect, but to be perfect, quote unquote, at work, and then come home and then do it all over again. And then like I leave myself in a situation where it's like I am depleted. I no longer have anything to give until 5 a.m. until I start this all over again. So I totally relate to that, and I just hope that the women who are listening or who will listen to that can pick up on those things, and then eventually, you know, set some boundaries. And then that's the question, the next question that I kind of wanted to ask you, if there are ways now that we recognize how it shows up, if there are ways, for instance, to put boundaries, whether it is with, at home, at work, how do we show up for ourselves? How do we stand up for ourselves, basically, in this whole journey?
Before I touch upon boundaries, I actually want to go back to something what you said in terms of like perfect, right? Perfect at work or
Mm-hmm.
at home. And I'm wondering if it's really the ideal of being perfect versus the ideal of being productive, right? Like,
Mm,
the reality is society says that we need to have these outcomes. So we have to have these outcomes and outputs for work. When it comes to our kids, we need to have these outcomes and outputs in terms of like we're raising great kids, like
yes.
they're well rounded, like, they're having all of their needs met, right? And I almost think it's more of the ideal that as moms we are, I want to say, the engine in terms of making things productive in our home, at work, or
Yes.
even for the entrepreneurs, like we are the engine of being like productive and saying, okay, we need to meet all of these. And sometimes, the slowdown is to say, like, are you running your home like a work office or a business, right? And that
Mm,
itself takes some slowing down and unlearning to say, well, what does home actually look like for you, and what do you want home to actually be for you, right?
mm-hmm.
I know for me, with my kids and my husband, I was like, the first thing is I want my home to be a home of love. Like that is priority. So if things are not the way how they're supposed to be, it doesn't matter, because what my kids feel inside the home, if they're feeling a sense of love and safety and security, I did a good job. Like if I want love,
Absolutely.
then it is what it is. Like
Yeah.
there's dishes in the sink, it is what it is. Like, so I think that's a part of it too, is letting go of the ideal of like, well, we need to produce for things to look perfect, or the ideal picture of perfect.
Mm-hmm. And I love that. And I'm learning to let go of the perfect or tedious house. Like, I'm learning to just leave the fingerprints on the doors and then like the dishes and everything. Because to your point, I think that's, like moving to a place of like having a house where there's love, constant love, where the kids are happy or where every member that shows up is actually happy to have a good time. I think that's what matters at the end of the day. Um, but yeah, it's I'm still working on that. But yeah, besides that, what are some other strategies that the women they can you will recommend to women so that they can manage and reduce their mental or and emotional labor?
One of the things that I recommend is really tapping into your community, like really establishing
Mm,
that village. And I'll give an example of when I was a single mom. When I was a single mom with Jalen, I was still in university, I was working, like I just had a lot going on. But I had two girlfriends that also had young kids, and we were able to create a community to support each other. To say, listen, I need a break for my kid. My kid's gonna sleep over for a weekend, and we would take turns just to give ourselves that break and that offload, right? We would
Mm-hmm.
intentionally come together to be able to like vent like what was happening or the parenting challenges that we were having. And our kids were relatively young, like 2, 3 years, 4 years old. It's like they can be a handful, right? And I think the reality is that community, I know from my own personal experience, was something that was super important and helpful, right? And I think there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of moms that are also, you know, migrating here from different countries, and they might not necessarily have that community. But I think the first thing would be to establish that community, especially if you don't have family, right? Find that
Yeah.
friend group that has kids in the similar age that understand that struggle, and say, okay, how can we support each other, right? That is community
Mm-hmm.
care. And as Black people, people of color, that's sometimes our superpower, is tapping into community, right? Tapping into that collective. So that's the first thing. The next thing is being able to um, slow it down and identify, okay, what are the things that are actually bothering you and making it hard for you to handle, or the things that you're like, I don't have any bandwidth for example, it might be like laundry, right?
Mm.
And it might be like, okay, I can't do laundry. This is like the folding just drives me insane. It might be requesting for your partner to say, okay, can you do this, right? Can you take this
Mm-hmm.
off my plate, right?
Yeah.
It might also be saying, okay, let's take turns with dishes, because I'm not always going to be the sole person doing dishes or even cooking, right? It might be calling in the moms, like the I'm talking about like our moms as mothers,
Yeah.
right? And saying, "Mom, you guys are empty nesters. Can you cook me a meal for our like, calling in our moms just to say like, can you just cook me a meal so I feel taken
Yeah.
care of, and I know my kids are good, right? I think those are some of the things that we can do, and are within our capacity to do. It helps with just saying there's one less thing that we have to do. I
Yeah.
also say for women, it is important for us to build in rest practices. Like, I stand by
Mm.
this by key. It doesn't matter how old or young your kids are. I literally say, when your kids are smaller, maybe it's not as long. Maybe it's like 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And you're like, this is mommy time. I'm not your mom for this next 15 or 20 minutes. Um, and the reason why, so that's something that I do with my kids, especially when I come in from a long day. I'm like, I just need like an hour. My kids are older, but because I started that from when they're young, when I'm like, I need my time, I have an hour in my room just to decompress. But then when I go
Yeah.
downstairs and I'm present, I'm more present. I'm showing up,
Yeah.
right? And I tell a lot of the clients that I work with is build in that time for you, just for you to decompress, for you to even just be who you are as a human being. Because I think that's also part of what's missing as moms is we are wearing so many different hats that we forget who we are and how to wear our own hat.
Mm-hmm.
So I always say build in that time for just you, and not just like
Absolutely.
once in a while, but on a daily basis. Like, what is your
Mm.
time? What is your own, where you get to be, for me, Choma, where Kelly, you just get to be Kelly. Like, what does that look
Yeah.
like, right? And how can you build that and structure that in your day?
Mm-hmm.
And that's gonna make you show up more present when you're with your kids. It's gonna make you have that sense of like, okay, I don't have to be so emotionally drained and overwhelmed when now you're engaging or dealing with the tantrum. You have that capacity because you gave yourself that break, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think those are my biggest tips when it comes to moms trying to set boundaries, try to figure out how to deal with the mental load, as well as the emotional one.
Yeah. And definitely, I think that that definitely makes a lot of sense. I think that going back to what you were saying, like one of the examples is to reach out to our moms and then say, for instance, like, can you cook us a meal? And I know most of them, I don't want to speak for everybody, but especially in my village, I know they will be happy to do so because they understand. They should at least, I will hope, understand where we're coming from when we're asking for that kind of support, right? So I feel like I need to do more of that. And On your other example, like just like that 1 hour, I cannot wait for my kids to be much older so I can teach them how to read the clock and say, you're not coming into my bedroom before this time. But one thing that I've learned with them so far, one is just the three of us, is to give them books because they're into books, and I'm just like, this is quiet time. You just be quiet and give me 30 minutes. I just need 30 minutes. And it seems to be, I have to say that I've only started this 2 weeks ago, and it's working so far, where I give them books and then I get to at least have a little bit of quiet time before chaos, before cooking meals and everything. So I think that there are definitely, to your point, definitely ways to set boundaries for ourselves, and then also to really ask for support, because at the end of the day, it really does take a village to raise children here. And so it just really takes that power of just like asking for support, right? So I definitely appreciate that comment. um
I also want to
mhm,
add, when we give, especially with young kids, because I think a lot of parents feel like, oh, my kids are too young, like I can't give them like 30 minutes of quiet time or something to distract themselves. If you intentionally take that 30 minutes and then you go back to them with positive reinforcement or like hugs or like,
mhm,
hey, I'm here, they will be like, oh, if I do this thing, right, my mom is going to show up more present for me. We're going
more,
to have a
yeah,
better connection. And
yeah,
intuitively they're just going to be like, oh, okay, this is a thing, this is a part of that routine. And it's also reinforcing that for your kids to say, it's okay, like I can be alone, my mom's going to come back to me and give me that positive security, that positive reassurance.
very true. That's very true. Yeah. Okay, so there's this one question that I wanted to ask, and it has to do with society. And so it's really, how can societal expectations and cultural norms contribute to the invisible load for particularly BIPOC mothers?
So I think one of the things, and I think I would be like, for the cultural piece, if I didn't talk about marriage, and I think
Mm-hmm.
marriage has to hold like a lot of cultural norms in terms of what that expectation might be for in-laws, in terms of how you have to show up or
Mm-hmm.
what that looks like for you as a mother or even a wife, that adds to that pressure, right? And I think the reason why I even touch upon this as even a wife is because if you and your partner are not on the same page, then you can't ask them for the support that you need to help with that, um, with the mental load, with the emotional stress and the drain that you're dealing with, right? And
Yeah,
sometimes the outside influence can be like external family, based on like their cultural norms or the way how they see that women are expected to do. Or some moms might be like, I did it, like you should be able to do it too, right? And just trying to normalize almost maladaptive practices, right? So I think
yeah,
that's part of the conversation when you start to think about like the cultural norms, is the added pressure that the marriage and maybe like outside adds
ooh, ooh,
to
yes. Absolutely. And I think in some cultures, yes, definitely the marriage and the family, outside family, is still family, but like it's not like the nuclear family comes into play, and that can definitely um cause more pressure. And I think, going back to what you were saying, like I think that even personally, I've been in situations where like I've seen moms saying that, well, if I have done this, why is it so hard for you to do this?
Mhm.
And it's really also, how do you even have conversation, or a conversation in that situation with your mom, saying that, well, there is a name to it, it's the invisible load. And then also there's probably also a difference of generations. Now
Yeah.
we do have a lot more to do. And I also want to speak from where I do come from, where, you know, some of the moms, they had support, immense support. Like you have family members, you have help, you have everything. Whereas here, with the high cost of living and everything, we tend to do a lot of things ourselves. So how do you even have that intergenerational conversation about like, well, this is different now. Like, I really need your help, like that mom or dad, right?
I think the thing that's also challenging is the fact that some of the things that we're going through is not necessarily a new phenomenon, but like it's everybody's feeling it type phenomenon, right?
Mm,
I think the reality is if I look at my grandparents' era, they had more community. Like, yes, they were in Canada, but they were way more connected, they were more in tune. I look at my mom, maybe she had a little bit less community, but she had her parents and her siblings step in as that community. And I
yeah.
think now it's like our generation is like in this super like tech era, like industry of like, okay, hyper individualism. It's more of like, well, we should be able to do it all. And I
Yes.
think that's kind of the deconstruction. And I wouldn't, so it's hard to almost put it as like the cultural norms, because I think the only cultural norm that stands here is maybe like the superwoman type of stereotype that we place on ourselves as like,
Mm-hmm.
patriarch was strong, we need to be strong women just like that. But outside of that, again, historically, Black communities have supported communities, right? Majority, and I know there's the people that don't fall into that, like I will recognize that, but historically we've actually tapped into the village,
Yes.
like we've tapped into how do we work together to support these kids and raise them well, right? Like whether that be with aunties and uncles or like family friends. And I know recently there's been a lot of things of like, well, this person wasn't that great to me, or these things like, and I think
Mm,
also those frameworks of now our generation is super aware of maybe like some abuse or some things that shouldn't have happening.
yeah.
I think now we're also cautious of like what that village looks like or what that community looks like. So I think
Yeah.
some intentionality between, us as mothers to say, okay, who is the right people in our community that's willing to be a part of our community, right? And
Mm,
how do we ask? Like, even for friends, I know my friends that are phenomenal. I know their household is phenomenal. I have open conversations with my kids to say if anything, like let me know, right? And now I'm tapping into that more to say, okay, you know what? My kids are a little bit older, and I'll be like, you are going to go spend a week at your aunt's house, and I'm going to have a break. um, so I think it's those things. So
mm-hmm.
I personally am starting to ask and tap into my community more. And I think that's something that we have to get comfortable with doing once we know that we have built a solid community, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I think that and I receive it, and I think it's good to have that kind of community and people you trust. And then you touch on something that is also super important. It's like having people like that you can trust, and then you know that your kids are going to be okay because, and we're talking about it already. It's like finding ways, like those self-care practices. Like I just need that time alone or that time to take care of myself and replenish myself. So you probably have to go in and spend some time with grandma or with auntie. Um, but there's, like in doing so, I recognize that there's some people who are not necessarily that fortunate. So how do you that fortunate to have people that they can trust, right? So how do you go about even that, right? Like how do you, especially if there has already been instances where that parent had some sort of experience like that. How do you rebuild that trust and say like, okay, my kid is going to be okay, or even put your kid in that situation where you can send them to that relative knowing that they will be actually okay. Like, I think that's a loaded question.
I, so I'm gonna break it down. I think there
Mm-hmm.
is, some parents that because of whatever hurt they've gone through or whatever harm they have gone through, they become hyper vigilant, and
Yeah.
they're scared to trust the community, and there's that distrust that happens. One of
Mm-hmm.
the easiest, like I always say, therapy is everyone's wellness, to say like, okay, how do we heal that and build your capacity to see who is meaningful support for you that can help
Yeah.
you, right? And like things with that, again, they are so unique, but they are a little bit of a longer journey and a little bit of a longer process, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I always say, like, what is the type of experiences that you want your kids to have in terms of like different ways of knowing, different ways of experiencing, different ways of recognizing the world is different outside of, right? I think the
Mm-hmm.
other piece that parents who might not trust like outside or trust community is you need to instill in your kid the ability to have a voice at all times. You need to say like, okay, these are the things that are not normal, and if it happens, tell me. And I think those are the things that need to be ingrained from a young age for kids. So I understand when a parent's like, I don't feel comfortable, but my challenge to that is, have you had that conversation with your kids to say, these are the things that you need to talk to me about, these are the things that's not
Mm-hmm.
important, these are the things that I will show up and protect you for, right? And then the next thing is being able to follow through. And I think what happens for so many parents, especially moms, is they fear like, what is the repercussion? Or
Mm-hmm.
are they going to have to live with that guilt, right? Or like, is my kid going to speak up on time, right? I think those are some valid fears that happen. And I would be amiss to not recognize those as like valid concerns. But again, you have to empower your kids at a young age.
Yeah. Yeah. That's valid. Wow, this is loaded. This is good. This is good. Okay, so I wanted to finish with these two questions. The first question really, and we started talking about it, which is, self-care practices. And then one of them was like, you know, dear kid, you have grandparents, go on. But what are other self-care practices that you could recommend to your mothers and then also other like parents to help them cope with the ongoing mental and emotional demands of parenting?
One of the things that I think it's important is to realize that this is also a season, right? Like whatever
Mm-hmm.
age your kids are at, it is just a season, and it will 100% change. I also say for parents that have young kids, get them to start learning how to do house chores and tasks within the house, because now when they're older, guess what? Guess who's going to help you with the dishes? Guess who's going to help you with some of those routines, right? Like, guess who's
Mm-hmm.
going to be independent enough to do their laundry, and they're immediately taking things off of your plate that would have normally
Mm-hmm.
fallen. So I would say that's also a part of it, is being able to build your resources in your home through your kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a part of the conversation. I think another thing that mothers can do is know when to ask for help when it feels like, okay, you're sitting with things. Again, even speaking with a therapist like myself, because what it does is it gives you the ability to process all the things mentally that you're sitting with and just get it out, right? It gives you a place
Yeah.
to offload, and that offloading creates so much release of like tension and stress, and now you're placing where these feelings are coming from. um and and then the last one would be, don't be scared to make the request for what you need. And if someone's not able to, see if there's somebody in your community that can. I know oftentimes when people hear no, or they're like, oh, maybe this person's not available, or maybe they're busy too, we're leading off of assumptions, but we don't know until we ask. And is there more than one person that you could ask? So if you know one person might say no, or they're giving you no, is there somebody else that you can go to? That's also okay.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah. And then I think also that's another thing that I can relate to is like sometimes when people say no, then I shut down. Like it's like, oh, okay, that's enough. I'm gonna try to figure this myself, for instance, instead of expanding. And then still looking in the community for more support. So yeah. Now when it comes to your work at Inner Compass Wellbeing, what are some common themes or challenges that you've observed related to this invisible load among your clients who are mothers? And as a final, like, statement, like, how are you supporting them in their journey?
Mhm. One of the biggest things is, and you kind of alluded to it, is not wanting to ask for help or figuring out, I need to figure it out on my own. Like, this is my burden to carry. And I
Mm-hmm.
always challenge that with saying, no, It's not like, who takes care of you, and how do you tap into the people who also take care of you and support you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think another common thing that I see, again, going back to what I said, is a lot of women feeling like they're just surviving, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, they're just going through the motions of like motherhood and prioritizing that. They're missing out on the present, the here and now, right? They're missing out on the memories, and actually really creating an environment where your kids have the sense of feeling of love, security, and stability, right? So I think those are some of the things that I see and I work through with a woman to say, how do we challenge that? Or how do you build in, especially for women who are surviving, how do you build in rest practices? What does that rest practice look like for you? Are you okay with the kitchen being messy and making sure that your room is always clean so you have that break to just go away to somewhere that feels good
Yeah.
for you, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so really working through some of like those like things that were like, okay, what can you offload? Even if it's like, if you've had a long day, don't feel guilty for ordering like pizza for dinner, right? Like,
Yeah.
reason, and that's okay too, because you're trying to show up better for yourself and your kids. So those are some of the things that I see. I think another thing is this constant, I need to keep going, I need to constantly be productive and busy with the kids. And that's always a challenge of like, are you really meeting your kids needs, or is there something here that you feel like society's telling you, or is there's a pressure here, or a sense of guilt if you don't do that? So that's another thing that I see. So and I think also for some it's balancing out like work and home, and trying to find that balance. I know that's one of my struggles. Like right after,
Yeah.
right? But just normalizing those things, and one of my biggest things is giving people, especially women, the language around what they're seeing, also giving them the tools to recognizing the feelings that they're feeling, and also recognizing what do you need, whether the feeling is uncomfortable, and then also recognizing when you are having these happy moments and these bursts of moments,
Mm-hmm.
what need is being met there? Something is being met. Can we pinpoint that and say, how can we get more of that and build more of that
Mm.
for our day to day?
Wow. And this is amazing. And then yes, I the work like mom work life balance is, or not balance, but like life is definitely something that is very challenging for, I'm sure, a lot of parents right now. And then especially in this economy, this global economy where there are a lot of parents who they're working more than one job, right? So and so that takes away again that time, that it takes that time away from the kids again. So it builds that, like I know for me, for instance, there's that guilt that comes with it. It's like, okay, another commitment that I have to make here, which means that I'm taking more time away from my kids. So I do appreciate this conversation. So just to close, like, if is there are there any is there anything that you can recommend? One last thing. I know you've made a couple of recommendations, and thank you so much for that. For 2025, going into 2025, what would you say to women, and especially women of color, who are doing the very, very best to be successful with their kids, to raise beautiful, talented kids, but also, try to provide for themselves and their family, and also have a life for themselves. So, what would you say to them today?
Okay, so for any of my clients that have worked with me, like me saying this, they're gonna laugh. But I always say, what is one kind thing that you can do for yourself today that gives you, that meets your immediate need, right?
Mm,
And that essentially is self-compassion, that essentially is kindness.
mm,
So my request to any mom that's out there is, what is one kind thing that you can do for yourself that will make you feel good or satisfied, or give you some type of joy or comfort, or whatever that might be, right?
mm,
So that is one thing. The next thing that I always say is rest practices. Find ways to build rest practices in your day. That could be even while you're at work. If it's one of my biggest things is transition breaks. So instead of going from one task to the next, is build in a 5-10 minute break just for
Wow.
yourself, right? When
Mm-hmm.
you come home, like take that 10, 15, 20, an hour of just you time, right? Wherever you can build in rest practices. And I have a book recommendation for any Black woman out there. It's called Rest is Resistant by Tracy Hershey. If you haven't read this book, it is phenomenally amazing. And I think that would fundamentally reshape how we even think about constantly doing as whether you're working, whether you're an entrepreneur and a mom, like doesn't matter where you are on your mom journey, even
Mm-hmm.
as just working moms at home or homemaker moms who are constantly going and going, it will help you rethink, okay, how do I build in more rest to this, and how rest is actually more resistant.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions today, Chioma. Again, like I said, Chioma is a registered social worker with over 10 years of experience. She has her own practice. It's called Inner Compass Wellbeing. Where can they find you?
So I am on Instagram and TikTok, more so on Instagram at innercompass_wellbeing. And you can also visit me on my website at www.embraceyourinnercompass.ca. I also have some exciting news, if it's okay if I can share it.
Of course.
So, Inner Compass is going to be having a launch party on April 12th to launch our wellness app. So, to make mental health way more accessible for a lot of the members of our BIPOC community. So, everyone is invited to our event on April 12th. It is in person in Kitchener. So, looking forward to seeing anyone who's willing to come.
I look forward to being there. I know that you have been amazing to me, to this community. It's such a blessing to have you and to have your expertise. And I hope that, our community can continue to learn from you and to apply some of the resources and then the advice that you have given us. And yeah, I look forward to seeing what you are doing. You're an amazing person. And then thank you so, so much for taking the time on this beautiful snowy Sunday. Hopefully one of the last snowy Sundays of the February or this winter because I've had enough. But thank you so, so much, Yoma, and I will talk to you later.
All right, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Let me stop the recording.